Good morning to everybody. My job is to see if I can give a bit of a background on what's going on as far as the economy is concerned. Heiko did mention that I'm going to provide you with certain facts, and unfortunately, being an economist, you don't always work with facts. But because even the past is not always certain. So what I will be doing, I will give you a bit of a background and some of our estimates in terms of what we expect for the economy and some other variables that I think are very important. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about politics. Clearly, what has happened the last couple of days, and in fact the last couple of weeks, and in fact I'd say the last 2 months or so, is that the president has been acting really presidential. I think the image of the president improved quite dramatically the last couple of weeks, and it's very clear that the president is in charge. Unfortunately, what we've also seen recently is a kind of a comeback fight coming from the alliance partners, essentially the ANC. The ANC is probably the ANC's biggest internal opposition, coming from the Communist Party, COSATU, as well as in from the ANC. So there seems to be a bit of a comeback. What I'm also a bit of a concerned about is that we are waiting for a final plan of cabinet, and they keep on postponing the date. The most recent date now is that we will get more information on Monday on what they plan to do in terms of the support to the South African economy and some other decisions that have been made and should be made. So we have to wait until Monday to get a better grip on what is likely to happen. Maybe just a comment about politics that I think is very important. We have to remember, if you give more power to bureaucrats and politicians, they will keep that power. And even after the crisis, I'm afraid we will have a more powerful political elite in South Africa. And a very good example is the Minister of Police saying that he considers, and I'm only using this as an example, to extend the liquor ban even after the lockdown. Now, that's an example of a bureaucrat trying to keep existing powers. As things stand at the moment, the politicians and of course the bureaucrats like the police have a lot of power, and it's our responsibility as individuals to make sure they give that power back after the lockdown. Of course, the politicians are also talking about the restructuring. We can think about what needs to happen in terms of the restructuring of the South African economy, and I have many ideas of what I mean by restructuring of the economy. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that my ideas of a restructuring corresponds with that of our political leadership. One piece of information that I received is that restructuring in terms of our political leadership also includes the acceleration of the national health insurance. That's certainly not what I had in mind about restructuring. Fortunately, also, under these sort of circumstances, certain decisions are simply enforced on the politicians. And a very good example is what's happening to South African Airways. And it seems to me at last, as if we have gotten rid of this huge destructive organization called South African Airways, and it seems to be on its way out. But again, there's no clarity on that. But at least the last demand from South African Airways for a bailout has been stopped by nobody else but Pravin Gordhan. One of the problems in actually this whole equation. So what's clearly happening, there are two inevitable conflicts that will happen over the next, and in fact, it's already happening. The first conflict is an ideological question. What are we going to be after the conflict or after the virus? Are we going to be more socialist, or are we going to be more free market oriented? But I think the important part is that we're probably going to have a weaker government after this lockdown. Another comment that I think is important making is that everybody's been talking about the fourth industrial revolution in recent years. And I think what we are seeing today is that the fourth industrial revolution is being forced upon us. We are currently, I'm talking to 300 people now, which is a huge privilege and an honor for me, but I'm doing it through a media that wasn't really known not that long ago. And everybody all of a sudden is using all this kind of new technologies. Our business is keeping going on as always, and I've never been this busy. So I think that's a very important point, but that also gives us an idea about the kind of sectors in the economy that will benefit from the future, from the fourth industrial revolution. One or two examples is obviously the sectors that will benefit will be the service industry, but not only the service industry associated with certain digital values that can be added. Exactly what we are doing at the Efficient Group as an example. So the financial industry will probably benefit from this. industries like, for example, asset management and the like, but certain other industries that will certainly suffer because of the lockdown, and eventually because of the way that the economy is going to pan out over time, will be industries like, for example, manufacturing, generally speaking, also things like, for example, the primary industries like agriculture in certain instances, and mining as well. So it will be interesting to see how things are going to pan out. Maybe we are learning as we go along. There are some interesting statistics coming from some other countries. A very good and interesting statistic coming from China is that even after they started opening their economy, is that people are still not buying, or not buying that much. So I think we could see a drastic change in spending patterns of consumers once the economy has been opened up again. All those sort of things that we have to keep an eye on, and we certainly are at the Efficient Group. One or two estimates of ours regarding economic growth that can be expected over the next year or so. Of course, the South African economy will be hugely impacted by this. The estimates vary quite greatly. Moody's just sent out their estimates, which is a very modest contraction of less than 3%. The Reserve Bank expecting roughly about 6% contraction for this year. Our estimates is around about 8%, but it keeps on changing. Suffice to say, we're going to see a significant contraction. It's going to be very, very painful to the South African economy. According to our estimates, we can see unemployment going up by more than a million for 2020. And many, many thousands of small businesses will simply not reopen their doors again. This is going to be extremely, extremely painful to the South African economy. We have done various other calculations, like, for example, what can be expected on the fiscal accounts. We expect the fiscal deficit around about 12% of GDP. State debt levels will exceed 80% of GDP within the next 2 years or so. And the state revenue will collapse because of an economy that is under tremendous strain. We expect our state revenue in the region of about 200, maybe even 300 billion rand below original budgeted estimates. The reality is that there is no much fiscal space for the state to spend money, and we will see some projects, and I believe that Monday we will get more clarity on this. But the reality is we need 300 or 400 billion rand stimulus package in the South African economy. We just do not have the capacity for that. I know there's a lot of talk about borrowing money from the International Monetary Fund. That is certainly not an option. We in South Africa use rands, and remember, if you want to borrow money from, say, example, the IMF, you're going to borrow dollars, and if you want to borrow dollars, you must answer the question, what do you want to do with the dollars? What do you want to import, or what foreign loans you want to pay off? And certainly we can import certain medical stuff as an example, but there's simply no reason for us to go and borrow huge amounts of money from the International Monetary Fund. We have just concluded some calculations over the weekend. We have to remember also is that poverty also kills. The South African life expectancy is around about 60 years, while that of the Europeans is around about 80 years, and their income is roughly about 3 times higher than what we have in South Africa. The point I'm trying to make, certainly people are dying, and more people will die because of this virus, but a lot of people will also die because of an increase in poverty. And we must ask the question if we should keep the economy in lockdown, because that will lead to deaths as well. My view is that we should try to open the economy as soon as possible. I think the political leadership made the right decision with information available, but what is becoming clearer by the day is that the South African economy is going to suffer quite tremendously because of this lockdown. An important point to make is that financial markets are always discounting the future based on the information available. That means that financial markets always react before an event takes place. And we've seen a huge contraction in the financial markets. The equity markets really contracting, and in fact, reacting quite volatile the last couple of weeks. We saw that all over the place. The forex markets, the capital markets, everything reacted quite violently as we get more and more information. So the financial markets trying to peer into the future to see what has happened. And the reason why I mentioned this is that financial markets are clever. Financial markets are always forward-looking, and I would really urge people not to take the unnecessary or hasty decisions in terms of your investments. Be careful. Financial markets are always forward-looking, and the financial markets will start rising. And in fact, we've seen some positive reaction on the financial markets because of certain stimulus packages, and financial market will start going up long before the economy starts growing again. So always keep that in mind. One or two comments about the South African Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank, I think, acted correctly. Fortunately, we have a governor at the South African Reserve Bank that is rather conservative when it comes to monetary policy. He's been running a tight monetary policy ship the last couple of years, and he was criticized many times before, even by economists telling him that he's been running interest rates far too high and that he should be cutting interest rates. Fortunately, he did not do that, but now that we actually need that, unlike, like for example, fiscal policy, we can actually use monetary policies to support the South African economy. And that's exactly what the Reserve Bank has done. And I agree completely with what the approach of the South African Reserve Bank at this stage. Interest rates have been reduced quite a lot. And surprisingly, we saw another 100 basis points cut, or 1 percentage point cut in interest rates this week. And it came a week before we expected another cut in interest rates. We expected this cut, but not so soon. I think it's the right thing to do, but the Reserve Bank has to be careful not to create the impression that they're starting to panic. The right thing to do is to cut interest rates, and I believe there will be scope to cut interest rates even further, but the Reserve Bank must always maintain a steady hand on monetary policy. So far, they're doing well. Just be careful not to overdo things in the short term. You may create the impression that you're starting to panic. The Reserve Bank is doing some other things as well that I think is the correct move. They've adjusted certain liquidity and capital ratios for banks, making it easier for banks to lend out money because it's easier for banks now to maintain certain ratios that are important for banks. Additionally, the South African Reserve Bank also decided to enter the secondary bond market. Now, that means that the South African Reserve Bank has started to buy government debt instruments in the secondary market. There's a so-called primary market. The primary market is where certain banks buy all new government bonds, and then they will sell it off into the secondary market. And the Reserve Bank decided then to participate or to also start buying bonds in the secondary market, and by doing that, providing more liquidity to the financial markets. The Reserve Bank is adamant this is not a form of quantitative easing, but I can tell you this thing walks a little bit like a duck, and it sounds a little bit like a duck, just maybe it is a duck. But we have to keep an eye on this. I think it's the right thing for the Reserve Bank to enter the secondary market. The real test for the Reserve Bank will be when they will have to exit that market, which must happen sometime over the next couple of months again. But we as economists, we keep an eye on that. And last month, for example, the Reserve Bank on a net basis acquired only 1 billion rands worth more of government bonds, which really isn't much. But if they do buy too much, I will start getting into that, and we will make sure that our clients know about that, and of course our investment teams know about that as well. One or two comments about the rand and the South African financial markets that I think are important as well. Firstly, is that the South African rand is a hugely undervalued currency. Many reasons for that, and we can expect more volatility, especially once there's some rebalancing happening on certain international funds. So the rand is hugely undervalued, which is important, and you will understand why just now. But it's also very important. South African bond yields are very attractive, and we currently offer around about 10% or so yields on the South African bonds. And even more important, South African financial markets are exceptionally liquid. The reason why I mentioned this is we have been downgraded by Moody's. When we see, for example, more stability coming back to the financial markets, foreigners and especially speculators will see that there's a very cheap entrance into South Africa by way of cheap currency. So the entrance is easy and cheap into South Africa. The bond yields are very attractive, and there's a lot of liquidity in the South African financial markets. And that simply means if they want to take a quick bite out of the cherry, they can do that in South Africa quite easily, which means I will not be surprised if we see a sudden and a relatively strong appreciation in the currency in the short term. Very much more volatility, but don't think the currency is a one-way bet. And the same goes for the bond market as an example. And maybe just one or two comments about what's happening internationally. We've seen massive stimulus coming from the various countries in the world, including stimulus from the fiscal and the monetary authorities. Interest rates have been slashed internationally. Various forms of quantitative easing have been announced by the various central banks internationally. And on the fiscal accounts, massive stimulus packages have been announced by the various countries. The biggest probably is coming in terms of monetary value coming from the Americans, obviously, but the Europeans are also announced some stimulus packages. I think the important one in Europe is probably the Germans that announced certain measures to support their economies as well. There are some dangers, especially from Europe, for example, the Italian bond market. I think that's something that we have to keep an eye on. But without a doubt, the world is going flat out in trying to support the world's financial markets and trying to support the economies as well. But I think it's inevitable. The world economy is in a recession. The world economy will contract. Most of the major economies will contract, and quite significantly, I believe, this year. And there's even a possibility that the Chinese economy, which is expected to grow around about 1%, perhaps 2% now, but it's even possible that the Chinese economy may enter into a recession. So without a doubt, significant economic contraction can be expected globally. South Africa certainly is not alone in this. But I can assure you, my team and I, we keep an eye on all these various variables. I write quite often, and if you just you can search for the Efficient Group if you don't get my research, and I will be happy to include you on our distribution list.